On November 18th, 1978, over 900 people died in a single afternoon in the jungles of Guyana. Mothers gave poison to their children. Families died in each other's arms, and most of them did it willingly, calmly, believing until their final breath that they were committing a revolutionary act. This was not a massacre by force. It was mass suicide orchestrated through psychological control so complete that death seemed preferable to disobedience. This is the story of how it happened and why it could happen again. The People's Temple Agricultural Project, known to the world as Jonestown, was supposed to be paradise. Jim Jones, the charismatic preacher who founded it, had promised his followers a socialist utopia in the jungle where they would be free from the racism and corruption of American society. They called him Father. They believed he could heal the sick, read minds, and see the future. They had left everything behind to follow him to this remote settlement carved out of the Guyanese rainforest. For some, it had been everything they hoped for, at least at first. But by November 1978, paradise had become a prison. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Loudspeakers mounted throughout the compound broadcast Jones's voice at all hours. Dissenters were drugged, beaten, or placed in a plywood box in the sun until they recanted. And Jones, once vibrant and energetic, had become a paranoid recluse addicted to drugs and convinced that the world was conspiring to destroy his. When Congressman Leo Ryan arrived to investigate allegations of abuse, Jones knew the end was near. Ryan and several members of his delegation were murdered as they tried to leave, and then Jones gathered his followers in the central pavilion and told them it was time for what he called revolutionary suicide. He had prepared them for this moment. They had rehearsed it during drills he called white nights, practice runs where they drank what they were told was poison, only to learn it was a loyalty test. But this time it was real. The vat was filled with cyanide-laced flavor aid, and one by one, parents took cups, filled them, and gave them to their children. Then they drank themselves. Within an hour, the pavilion was covered in bodies. This was not the act of mad, irrational people. It was the culmination of years of systematic psychological manipulation that transformed autonomous individuals into extensions of a single will. And understanding how that transformation occurred is more important now than ever, because the mechanisms Jim Jones used are not unique to him. They are fundamental features of how human minds can be controlled. Jim Jones did not begin as a monster. He began as an idealist, a young preacher in Indiana who opened his church to all races at a time when segregation was still the norm. He preached social justice, economic equality, and brotherhood. He ran soup kitchens and provided housing for the poor. People who knew him in those early years described him as compassionate, tireless, and genuinely committed to helping the marginalized. But somewhere along the way, the mission became secondary to the man. Jones discovered that he had a gift for manipulation, a talent for reading people and telling them exactly what they needed to hear. And more intoxicating than any drug, he discovered the pleasure of absolute control. The process of indoctrination into the People's Temple was gradual and carefully orchestrated. No one joins a cult knowing it is a cult. They join what appears to be a community offering purpose, belonging, and answers to the problems that plague them. Jones targeted people who were searching, people who felt alienated from mainstream society, people who wanted to believe that a better world was possible. He offered them a family, a mission, and a father figure who seemed to genuinely care about their well-being. In the beginning, the demands were small. Attends service régularly. Volunteer. Time to help the community. Donate a portion of your income to support the church's charitable work. Each commitment was framed as voluntary, as a choice you were making because you believed in the cause. But each commitment also made it slightly harder to leave. You had invested time, money, relationships. Walking away would mean admitting that investment was wasted. This is the psychology of escalating commitment, a trap that ensnares people in situations they would never have entered if they had known where it would lead. Robert Cialdini, the psychologist who studied compliance and persuasion, identified this as one of the most powerful mechanisms of social influence. Once you have taken a public stand, especially one that required sacrifice, you experience enormous psychological pressure to behave consistently with that stand. Jones understood this instinctively. He structured the temple so that each level of involvement required a greater sacrifice than the last. You gave your time, then your money, then your possessions. You cut ties with skeptical family members who questioned your commitment. You moved into communal housing where you were surrounded constantly by other believers. And eventually, you relocated to Jonestown, thousands of miles from anyone who might challenge the narrative you had come to accept. By the time people arrived in Guyana, they were already deeply psychologically invested. They had burned bridges, abandoned careers, severed relationships. Admitting that Jones was not who he claimed to be would mean confronting the possibility that they had destroyed their former lives for a lie. And so instead of admitting doubt, they suppressed it. They rationalized the inconsistencies. They explained away the warning signs. This is cognitive dissonance in its most destructive form, the mental contortions people perform to avoid the psychological pain of acknowledging they made a terrible mistake. But Jones did not rely solely on people's unwillingness to admit error. He actively structured the environment to eliminate opportunities for independent thought. In Jonestown, residents worked in the fields from dawn until dusk, physically exhausted by labor in the tropical heat. Meals were inadequate, leaving people in a state of semi-starvation that sapped their energy and impaired their cognitive function. Sleep was minimal, interrupted frequently by alarms calling everyone to the pavilion for emergency meetings that could last until 3 or 4 in the morning. Jones would rant for hours about conspiracies against the community, about traitors in their midst, about the necessity of absolute loyalty. This was not accidental. Sleep deprivation and malnutrition are classic techniques of thought reform because they weaken the psychological defenses that allow people to maintain independent judgment. When you are exhausted, hungry, and overwhelmed, your capacity for critical thinking collapses. You become more suggestible, more compliant, more willing to accept what you were told rather than expending the energy to evaluate it. Jones also employed what psychologists call information control. Residents of Jonestown had no access to outside news except what Jones chose to share with them, and what he shared was carefully filtered to reinforce his narrative. He told them that the United States was descending into fascism, that concentration camps were being prepared for socialists and minorities, that Jonestown was the only safe place left in the world. He fabricated news reports and staged fake attacks on the compound to create a siege mentality. When you believe you're surrounded by enemies, when you believe the world outside is hostile and dangerous, the leader who promises protection becomes indispensable. You stop questioning him because you believe your survival depends on him. This technique of creating an us versus them mentality is fundamental to cult control. It transforms the group into a besieged island of righteousness in a sea of corruption and malice. Anyone who questions the leader is not just wrong, they are a traitor. an agent of the enemy, a threat to everyone's safety. This makes dissent psychologically unbearable. To express doubt is to risk being labeled a defector, cast out from the only community you have left, abandoned to the hostile forces that supposedly wait outside. And so people silence their own doubts. They perform loyalty even when they have stopped feeling it. And over time, the performance becomes indistinguishable from genuine belief. Jones also used a technique psychologists call love bombing, followed by intermittent reinforcement. When new members joined the temple, they were showered with affection, praise, and attention. They were told they were special, chosen, part of a vanguard that would change the world. This intense positive reinforcement created a powerful emotional bond. But once someone was committed, the unconditional love became conditional. Jones's approval had to be earned through increasingly extreme demonstrations of loyalty. He would praise you one moment and humiliate you publicly the next, keeping you in a state of perpetual anxiety about your standing. This is the same mechanism that creates trauma bonding in abusive relationships. The unpredictability of the reinforcement, the alternation between warmth and cruelty, creates a desperate need for the abuser's approval. You become psychologically dependent on the person who is harming you, constantly striving to win back the unconditional love that was promised, but is now always just out of reach. Jones also cultivated an image of omniscience and omnipotence that made resistance seem futile. He claimed to have psychic powers, to know what people were thinking and planning. He staged elaborate faith healings where plants in the audience would pretend to be cured of cancer or paralysis, and true believers would testify that they had witnessed miracles. He had informants throughout the community who reported private conversations back to him, allowing him to confront people with knowledge he could not have obtained through normal means, reinforcing the illusion that he could read minds. When you believe your leader knows your every thought, when you believe he has supernatural insight into your loyalty or disloyalty, the possibility of hidden resistance evaporates. You police your own thoughts because you believe he can see them. This creation of an all-seeing, all-knowing authority is a form of psychological panopticon, a concept the philosopher Michel Foucault borrowed from prison architecture. The panopticon is a structure where prisoners can be observed at any time but cannot see the observer, creating a state of conscious and permanent visibility that ensures the automatic functioning of power, even when the observer is not actually watching. The prisoner behaves as if they are because they cannot know when they are being observed. Jones created a psychological panopticon in Jonestown. People internalized his surveillance and became their own jailers. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Jones's control was his ability to reframe suicide as a noble act. He introduced the concept gradually, first in sermons, where he spoke romantically about martyrdom and sacrifice for the cause. Then through the White Knight drills, rehearsals where members practiced drinking poison, treating it as a drill, a test of loyalty. Each time they complied, they proved to themselves that they were willing to die for the cause, and each rehearsal made the actual event seem less unthinkable. This is systematic desensitization, a process where repeated exposure to a frightening stimulus reduces the fear response. By the time the real event occurred, it was not a shocking break from normalcy. It was the culmination of a ritual they had performed many times before. Jones also framed the act in ideological terms that transformed it from suicide into revolutionary protest. He told his followers that their deaths would send a message to the world, that they would expose the cruelty of the forces arrayed against them, that history would remember them as martyrs who chose death over capitulation. This is not irrational delusion. This is the power of narrative to reshape perception. When suicide is framed as sacrifice, when death is framed as defiance, when annihilation is framed as transcendence. People who would never kill themselves under normal circumstances can be led to do exactly that. They are not dying. They are making a statement. They are achieving immortality through their commitment to the cause. And for many in Jonestown, especially those who have been with Jones for years, who had sacrificed everything to follow him, who had suppressed every doubt and burned every bridge, the alternative to dying with the community was psychologically intolerable. To refuse would be to admit that everything they had believed was a lie, that everyone they had trusted had been deceived, that their entire adult life had been wasted in service to a charlatan. The psychological cost of that admission was so high that death genuinely seemed preferable. This is not stupidity. This is the tragic endpoint of sunk cost reasoning taken to its most extreme conclusion. The recordings from that final day, the so-called death tape, are among the most disturbing documents in modern history. You can hear Jones speaking in a calm, almost soothing voice, telling his followers that this is their moment, that they are going to meet in another place, that the children will be at peace. You can hear a woman named Christine Miller challenging him, arguing that there must be another way, that they should try to escape to Russia. And you can hear the crowd shouting her down, insisting that death is the only option that they're proud to. You can hear children crying in the background. You can hear parents trying to comfort them. And then, eventually, you hear only silence. Not everyone died willingly. Some are murdered, injected with poison, or shot as they tried to flee into the jungle. But the majority complied. They believed, or they had convinced themselves to believe, or they could not bear the alternative. Survivors who managed to escape describe a kind of trance state, a dissociative numbness where people moved mechanically through the motions of self-destruction. This is what total psychological control looks like at its endpoint. Not dramatic resistance, but quiet compliance. Not screaming defiance, but calm resignation. The will to resist had been systematically dismantled over years of manipulation until what remained was a hollow obedience that persisted even unto death. The question that haunts us is whether this could happen again. The answer, uncomfortable as it is yes. The psychological mechanisms Jones exploited are not unique to the 1970s. They are fundamental features of human cognition and social behavior. The need for belonging, the desire for purpose, the tendency toward cognitive dissonance, the power of incremental commitment, the susceptibility to information control, the effectiveness of sleep deprivation and malnutrition in breaking down resistance. All of these remain as potent today as they were in Jonestown. And while most modern cult-like organizations do not end in mass death, they employ the same techniques to control behavior, extract resources, and maintain loyalty. You see these patterns in multi-level marketing schemes that isolate participants from skeptical friends and family. You see them in extremist political movements that create alternate information ecosystems where external facts cannot penetrate. You see them in abusive relationships where one person systematically dismantles the other's sense of reality and self-worth. You see them in corporate cultures that demand total devotion and frame any work-life balance as disloyalty. The scale and severity vary, but the underlying mechanisms remain consistent. What makes someone vulnerable to this kind of control is not stupidity or weakness. It is the universal human need for meaning and connection. The people who followed Jim Jones were not fools. They were teachers, nurses, veterans, people with families and careers. They were people who wanted to believe that a better world was possible and that they could be part of creating it. Jones offered them that vision, and by the time they realized the cost, they were already trapped in a web of psychological commitments that made escape seem impossible. The tragedy of Jonestown is not just that 909 people died. It is that they died believing they were doing the right thing, that their deaths had meaning, that they were sacrificing themselves for a cause greater than their individual lives. They died as true believers, and that belief was the ultimate expression of Jones's control. He had not just commanded their obedience. He had transformed their understanding of reality itself so thoroughly that they could not see what was happening to them, even as it destroyed them. The aftermath of Jonestown introduced a phrase into the popular lexicon that has since been trivialized and misused. People say don't drink the Kool-Aid casually, using it to mean don't blindly follow a trend or accept an idea uncritically. But the people in Jonestown were not drinking Kool-Aid. They were drinking Flavor Aid, and they were not doing it blindly. They were doing it because every psychological defense they once possessed had been systematically stripped away because they had been conditioned over years to equate obedience with virtue, because the alternative to compliance was a confrontation with reality too painful to endure. Reducing their deaths to a metaphor for gullibility is not just inaccurate, it is obscene, and it is dangerous because it allows us to maintain the comforting fiction that we would have been different, that we would have seen through the manipulation, that we are too smart or too strong to be controlled. But the research on influence and persuasion tells us otherwise. Under the right conditions, with the right combination of isolation, exhaustion, incremental commitment, and ideological framing, almost anyone can be led to act in ways they would previously have considered unthinkable. You are not immune. Your rationality is not a shield. Your intelligence is not a defense. And believing that you are invulnerable is precisely what makes you most at risk, because it prevents you from recognizing the early warning signs when they appear in your own life. Jim Jones did not possess supernatural powers of persuasion. He simply understood human psychology better than his victims understood themselves. He knew that people are desperate to belong, that they will suppress doubt to avoid cognitive dissonance, that incremental commitment can lead them down paths they would never have chosen in a single leap, that exhaustion and isolation break down critical thinking, that framing can transform suicide into martyrdom. And he used that knowledge to build a machine that converted autonomous individuals into obedient instruments of his will. The true horror of Jonestown is not that it happened, but that it was predictable that the psychological techniques Jones used were not secret or mysterious, that researchers had already documented and described the mechanisms by which minds could be captured and controlled. The people who died in that jungle clearing were not weak or stupid. They were human. And if you believe that their humanity was different from yours, that you possess some special immunity to the forces that destroyed them, then you have already taken the first step toward becoming the next person who drinks the poison and dies believing it was your choice. If this story unsettled you, sit with that feeling. Do not dismiss it. Think about the groups you belong to and the leaders you trust. Think about the commitments you have made and the bridges you have burned. Think about the information you consume and whether you have access to perspectives that challenge your beliefs. Think about whether you are sacrificing things you value because someone has convinced you it is necessary. You do not have to be in a jungle compound to be under someone's control. The techniques are the same whether the stakes are life and death or simply your money, your time, and your sense of self. Subscribe to this channel for more examinations of the psychology that shapes and sometimes destroys human lives. Leave a comment sharing what warning signs you now recognize in your own experience. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how easily minds can be captured And remember that the best defense against manipulation is not confidence in your own immunity, but constant vigilance about the forces acting on your mind and the willingness to question even the beliefs you hold most dear.